Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. The dwarfs are on the march again in the old world, and Ungrim Ironfist is leading the charge. Today we'll be painting him with contrast paints and some traditional techniques, so let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I undercoated it with white primer and attached it to a cork for easier handling. I started off by base coating the skin with an equal parts mix of contrast medium and Darkoath flesh. When working with contrast, apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint. The paint will continue flowing into the recesses for a little while, so keep an eye out for any excessive pooling. I painted the skin one more time with full strength Darkoath flesh. I find that I get much smoother results by applying a couple layers of contrast paints, instead of trying to get it all in one layer. Next, I base coated the horns and fabric with Skeleton Horde. I'd like to paint two different shades of green on the fabric, and I'll paint the first one with Karandras green. I'm not worried if some of the green gets on the other areas, like the stuff hanging off the belt, since I'll be painting that with opaque paint later. After the first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. I'm going to leave the green for now and base coat the metal areas with Iron Hand steel. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. Next, I shaded the steel and the green with a mix I affectionately call Armour Wash. The mix used to be equal parts Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, but I recently developed this new mix of equal parts Ratling Grime, Contrast Medium, and Lamian Medium. It's similar to the old mix, but a little bit stronger, so it creates darker shadows without requiring a second coat. Next I painted the hair with Jokaero orange. It's okay if some orange gets on the armor trim or the axe handle, since I'll be base coating those with opaque paint later. But I want to make sure to avoid making any mistakes on the areas I've already painted. Next I shaded the hair with Gryph-Hound orange. I really like using this color as a shade, rather than on its own as a base coat. Before I paint the gold, I want to add a thin black line around each detail. This technique is often called blacklining, and it will give the details a lot more definition. You could skip this step if you want to, but I think it's worth the extra effort. While I had the black paint out, I also painted the pouch and the trim around the bottom of the fabric. We've received a few requests for a muted gold recipe, and I like the look of the muted gold on the box art, so let's paint up something close to that. I mixed about 3 parts Stormhost silver to 1 part Retributor armor, and I base coated all the gold areas. Remember to leave a thin, black outline. It'll help give the details extra definition. After the first layer dries, you may want to paint a second layer for a bright, even finish. Normally I use a warm brown to shade gold, but in this case I'm going to use Nuln Oil. Using black will establish shadows without changing the color temperature. It's really easy to add warm tones with glazes, and I'll show how to do that later in the video. After the first layer dried, I painted a second layer in a few select areas to build up the depth. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. The main color for this army is green, and I'd like to add one more shade of green to the model. So I painted the fabric trim with Caliban green, leaving a thin, black outline. The reason I painted it solid black first is because Caliban green goes best over a dark undercoat. If I didn't paint it black first, I'd have to paint 2 or maybe 3 layers of the green. This way I only have to paint 1. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some more details and highlights, so let's keep going. First I highlighted the skin, starting with glazes of Kislev flesh. I think the secret to painting skin is all about glazing. Thin the paint with water, and with barely any paint on your brush, start building up layers and depth. If some of the shadows look too dark, I'll paint a glaze or 2 over those areas as well. Notice how quickly the paint dries, and how it barely tints the colors underneath. Building up transparent layers like this is the key to getting smooth blends. Also notice how the paint doesn't flow anywhere. It's staying exactly where I put it. If the paint flows or runs on the model, it means you have too much paint on your brush. I believe that loading the brush properly isn't talked about enough. Glazing in this way depends on having very little paint on your brush. The thinner the paint is, the less of it you want on your brush. Since this paint is very thin and diluted, my brush has next to nothing on it. It's just barely enough to dampen the surface of the model and leave a thin film of paint. I continued building up the highlights with glazes of Flayed flesh. Just like the first round of glazing, thin the paint with water and make sure there's barely any paint on the brush. Build up the layers wherever you think the light will hit the most. The brush will deposit a little more paint where it last touches the model, so I like to move the brush towards the highlight. That way more paint will end up in the section that I want lighter. We can't have a Slayer without some tattoos, and here's a simple and easy way I like to paint tattoos. Start off by mixing some black paint with the base skin color, in this case Kislev flesh. Thin the paint with water, and paint it just like the glazes earlier. With barely any paint on the brush, sketch out the designs. I'd recommend sketching out your designs on paper first, that way you have a clear idea of what to do. Build up a couple layers of the dark gray paint, and build up more of the paint in the shadow areas. Once you're happy with the designs, go back to Kislev flesh and paint a very thin glaze over most of the tattoo. I find this layer really helps diffuse the edges, and it makes the tattoo look like it's part of the skin, rather than just painted on. Let's move on to the green next. I began with a glaze of Warpstone glow on the lighter green section. If your green base coat dried a little lighter, you may need to add a small amount of toxic yellow. Fortunately, Warpstone glow was a perfect match for mine, and I didn't have to adjust it. Next, I added a small amount of toxic yellow and painted a fine highlight along the edges. Toxic yellow has really strong tinting strength, so you won't need to add very much. I decided to push the highlights one step further and mixed in some more toxic yellow. I used the same process to highlight the darker green trim. I lightened up Caliban green with a small amount of toxic yellow, and picked out the edges with a wide highlight. I mixed in some more toxic yellow and painted a narrow highlight along the edges. I'd like this green to stay pretty dark, so I'm trying to keep the line very narrow and not too bright. Next, I highlighted the bottom edge of the fabric and the grooves along the horns with Bonewhite. I'd like to add one more highlight to the horns, so I painted a few thin lines of white near the top. I highlighted the black leather next with gray number 2 from my custom grayscale. And you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Eshin Gray is close. Then I highlighted the leather one more time with gray number 4 from my custom grayscale. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is a close match. Next, I highlighted the edges of the hair with Fire Dragon. I like to pick out most of the edges, but you could paint as much or as little as you like. I'd like to take the highlights one step further, so I mixed some toxic yellow into the Fire Dragon, and I picked out a few of the upward facing strands and the sharpest edges. Let's move on to the metals next. I highlighted the steel with a glaze of Iron Hand steel. Shades tend to dull down the shine of metallic paints, and since the fresh paint is more reflective than what's currently on the model, I like to think of this highlight like I'm polishing the metal. Rather than paint it everywhere, I'm painting it where I'd like the highlights to be. The steel is lacking contrast right now, and my favorite way to boost the contrast is to deepen the shadows with glazes of black paint. Generally, I like to add the shadows after, because I feel like I get a smoother blend with the shading, rather than with highlights. But you could paint the shadows first if you like. The order shouldn't make too much of a difference. With the shading applied to the steel, next I highlighted both the steel and the gold areas with Stormhost silver. You can add some scratches here and there too if you like, or you could just paint the edges. The gold is lacking some warmth, and we'll fix that with some light glazing of Skeleton Horde. I thinned the paint with a small amount of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I applied it over the gold sections. The paint should dry almost as soon as it leaves the brush, and if it flows or runs off the brush, it means you have too much paint. Each layer will tint the gold beneath it, and you'll notice that it's getting warmer and more of a yellow-brown color. You could use any color you like for glazing metals. Normally I go for really vibrant colors, and you could glaze with something like Cassandora yellow if you want a brighter effect. I base coated the gems with black paint. Then I painted over it with Kantor blue, leaving a thin black outline. I painted the bottom half of each gem with thinned Caledor sky blue. After the first layer dried, I painted a second a little closer to the bottom. Then I painted a crescent shape along the bottom of the gem with Lothern blue. I painted an even smaller crescent shape with a mix of Lothern blue and white. Finally, I added a dot of white on the top. I used an old brush to apply a generous amount of wood glue to the top of the base. Then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown, and then Balor brown. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Rhinox hide, and after that dried, I added patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I think I enjoy painting old world models the most. It's hard to pick an army though. I want to collect everything. Would you like to see more old world content on the channel? What armies would you like to see? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.